Pocket Bomberman for Game Boy Color, also available for Game Boy Not Color, is not your typical Bomberman title. For those requiring a refresher, this is a typical Bomberman game. You guide your little Bomberman around an overhead playfield, lay bombs to clear away roadblocks and eventually kill enemies and rivals, and collect power-ups along the way to enhance your destructive power. Now in a sense, Pocket Bomberman does a similar thing, except it's now done in the form of a side-scrolling platformer. And yes, there's also a side game that involves lots of jumping, but none of that classic overhead Bomberman gameplay. By that account, the game should be terrible, and it actually isn't. It's actually quite decent, albeit a bit simplistic. The general premise of Pocket Bomberman remains the same as a traditional Bomberman title. You play as Bomberman and you must clear the level of enemies by killing them with bombs. Once you kill all the bad guys, you proceed to the door to move on to the next level. Sounds relatively simple enough. Hidden throughout the levels and various bits of scenery that you have to bomb to uncover are power-ups that can either increase the explosive yield of your bombs, or allow you to lay more bombs, or even grant you other abilities such as invincibility, armor, and even remote detonators, to name a few. You know, the typical Bomberman stuff, except now done in a side-scrolling platformer. There are 5 worlds, each with 5 levels. 4 levels are the typical side-scrolling Bomberman stuff, fairly straightforward stuff, and the final level of each world is a boss fight where you, well, fight a boss. You defeat the boss and you move on to the next world. Again, sounds simple enough. So here's the deal. Pocket Bomberman is simple. Some would argue very simple. Enemies have fairly simple strategies and sometimes move fairly slow. Levels boast different gimmicks depending on the world, but generally feel similar in terms of layout and difficulty. So once you get a feel for everything, they should be fairly easy to conquer. Even if you die, it shouldn't take long to find all the power-ups necessary to get back to your former glory. Unless you're in the middle of a boss fight, in which case, good luck. Bosses are probably the only real tough spots in Pocket Bomberman, since they can move all over the place while Bomberman is a victim of gravity. After a couple tries, it shouldn't take you more than an hour at most to beat the whole thing. Probably not even that long if you get really good at it. For a home console release, this would have been a lightweight thing, but for a portable game, it's fine. There's even a password for those who want to skip the early stuff and head to the harder stuff. Such as it is. But setting aside the difficulty, Pocket Bomberman actually plays pretty decently and manages to adapt the classic Bomberman gameplay into a side-scrolling format rather well. The general premise doesn't deviate entirely from familiar lore, so a Bomberman veteran could jump into this and only adjust to the side-scrolling aspect for a moment before getting the hang of it rather quickly. Even better is that Bomberman controls rather well. You can move him while in mid-jump, you could use bombs as temporary platforms to reach higher ground, and he responds to control inputs rather well. He might have a hard time fitting through narrow passages when jumping, but it's a minor point. Even the flipped button mapping of B jumps A bombs, a common ailment of poor platformers, doesn't deter from the overall gameplay. Pocket Bomberman actually makes that setup seem natural, a rarity if there ever was one. As an aside, there's an additional minigame called Jump Mode, in which players must guide Jumpman through an easy, medium, or hard course. Bomberman will constantly jump, and the player can only place bombs in this mode. The object, of course, is to reach the top of the course in one shot. It's a nice diversion if nothing else, but outside of trying to get a higher score, there's not much to this one. Pocket Bomberman boasts relatively simple graphics. The intermissions and cutscenes look fairly decent, but the in-game graphics are fairly basic stuff. Level design in general is rather bland looking with only moderate differences in terms of appearance and aesthetics, and the overall feel of the game is that of a monochrome Game Boy title that just so happens to feature color for the sake of color. Although to be fair, this particular comment could be levied towards a number of early Game Boy Color games, primarily those that also happen to be backwards compatible with the original monochrome Game Boy. On the bright side, Bomberman and the various enemies look fairly decent despite their small size, and the bosses are well rendered. And the game plays at a moderate enough pace that blurring would be a minimal issue if played on an original Game Boy or something, I guess. It's not a bad looking game per se, it's just simple looking. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. Sound is about average. Sound effects are somewhat decent but nothing too special. Music is also fairly average stuff as well. There's some hints of familiar Bomberman tunes played if you could recognize them. Jump Mode has a tune from a prior game whose name I don't recall. But that's about all worth mentioning. It's not a bad set of tunes per se, but it's nothing special. Yep, Overall, Pocket Bomberman for the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Not Color is a nice novelty title in the Bomberman series that does a good enough job of bringing tried and tested Bomberman gameplay to a different playstyle, but once you get past the novelty of that aspect, you're left with a game with little substance. Not to say it's a bad game, it's alright for a road trip or something, it's playable, it's enjoyable, it's Bomberman in a platformer and is not too bad actually, but it's also a game that you play it once, you're satisfied, and you'll move on to something else. It might merit a playthrough or two if you're into Bomberman or you just want a simple platformer for the kids to play, but for those wanting something a little more, you're best served looking elsewhere. I enjoyed it for what it's worth, so there.